This is Small Changes in Teaching, Big Results in Learning by John Fanselow, presented by the TEFLology Podcast. Hello, and welcome to the third episode in this series of audio extracts from John Fanselow's book. This episode comes from Chapter 8, Section 2, and it's called Some Ways to Make Small Changes. Enjoy.
There are many ways to make small changes in our teaching. One is to stop doing something we habitually do that we are not aware of until we record a lesson and transcribe a 1 to 3 minute segment of it. I have called these habitual unconscious communications rules and have urged teachers to break the rules they normally followed. If we see that we say "very good" every time a student responds, even when some of the responses are wrong, we can try to stop saying it. If we see in a transcription that we ask the same students to respond all the time, we can invite other students to respond. Another way to make small changes is to do the opposite of what we usually do. If we usually tell students to go to the lesson at the beginning of the class, we instead can ask students to write what they think the goal of the class was at the end of the class. If we normally have students respond orally to our spoken questions, we can try the opposite by having them write both our questions and their responses before they say them. If we always stand in front of the class when we give a dictation, we can stand in the back. We can take attendance at the end of the class rather than at the beginning. Observing how we communicate outside of the classroom can be another source of opposite activities that we can try in our classes. When we are across a train platform from a friend, and the noise from the trains prevents us from hearing each other, we often just mouth the words. So we can try giving instructions by mouthing rather than saying words, to mimic one rule we follow in certain situations out of the classroom, but usually do not follow in our classroom. Asking how what we think is useful might not be, and how what we think is not useful might be, is another way to make small changes. If you think that teaching reading should be separate from the other skills, then you have to ask how teaching reading alone might not be as efficient or effective as teaching it together with one or more of the other skills. If you believe that when students are a bit confused you have failed in your teaching, you have to ask how a little confusion might be beneficial and an important part of learning. You might have noticed that outside of classes, people are often standing up when they write and using very small pieces of paper or pages in small notebooks. Or in the case of younger students, they are standing while text messaging. Comparing how many words students write while standing using small cards with how many they write if they are sitting and using standard sheets of blank paper will show the effect of trying the opposite of the almost universal classroom practice: write only while sitting, except of course when writing on the board. Alternative activities will not necessarily produce better results, but if we do not change our routines, we will never know. Only by engaging in the generation and exploration of alternatives will we be able to see, and then we will see that we must continue to look. I wrote this in 1987 in Breaking Rules. I just suggested 3 ways to generate alternatives. Stop doing what you usually do by breaking your habitual unconscious behaviors, rules. Try doing the opposite of what you usually do, or having your students do the opposite of what you usually have them do. And do something, or have your students do something inside the classroom that is commonly done only outside the classroom. When I discuss these 3 ways with teachers, they invariably raise questions about how the small changes I suggest they try are related to learning assumptions or about fads and jargon in the teaching of English. Of course, there is overlap between the 3 ways I have suggested and learning assumptions and fads and jargon. To consider these, you can write down your assumptions about learning, the fads and jargon you are familiar with, and your idea of your role as a teacher and match them with activities you have your students do. If you think that students learn from making predictions rather than memorizing, then write down which of the activities your students do focus on memorization and which focus on predicting. If you want to understand cooperative learning better, write down a few activities your students do in groups or pairs that you think show they are learning together, and a few that show that they are not. Anytime I suggest even a small change in a workshop, teachers' hands go up. I have to follow our textbook, so how can I make any changes? If I do anything differently than my colleagues, they will start treating me coldly. My principal is like a general. He thinks my role is to follow his orders. Not following his orders results in an invitation, no, an order to see him in his office. As these comments are being made, most teachers are nodding their heads in affirmation. But the strongest nods come when a teacher says, "We have to prepare our students for tests." In addition to the constraints just mentioned, teachers themselves, not necessarily consciously, resist change because of what they consider to be their role and because of their assumptions about how we learn and fads in our field. A key reason I have advocated small changes for the past 40-ish years is because of the questions that teachers always raise in both workshops I lead and in my classes. I have visited hundreds of teachers in their classrooms and have experienced the emotional pressure to follow the usual routines and practices. Often, the first comments during discussions of lessons I observe deal with the constraints teachers feel. I would like to do X, but I can't because of blah, blah, blah. As a result of the restraints teachers felt, I started to suggest not only small changes, but trying the small changes for short amounts of time. This is one I have suggested for the end of class. Today, class, we have a few minutes left after the lesson. Please write down what you thought the goal was today, either in English or your first language. Teachers were consistently surprised at how their students' descriptions of goals were usually unrelated to their own goals, and they also realized that a few minutes can produce information out of proportion to the amount of time taken. Another small change I have suggested is about tardiness. Some teachers will wait a few minutes after the official starting time of class, not wanting to begin until all students that are coming are there. One thing I suggest is that teachers ask students to write anonymously what they like the most and least about an activity the teacher has done in the previous lesson during these few minutes waiting for the late students. Again, teachers are astonished by what students write. Therefore, I urge you to try making a few small changes for just a few minutes in each class a couple of times a week. As you record, transcribe parts of the recordings, ideally with your students, and discuss with your students what you and your students actually did, they will indicate which small changes you tried they found useful and which they didn't. You can then decide thoughtfully the amount of time to spend with these alternatives, and you might increase the time slightly. During breaks in my classes and workshops, I often put kaleidoscopes on the participants' desks. They immediately pick them up and look into them and turn them. When I ask them why, they say they want to see how the design changes. To me, turning the barrels of kaleidoscopes reveals the natural curiosity we all have for seeing what happens when we make small changes. If we turn the barrel even 1 millimeter, the design is quite different. Though the changes I advocate are all very small, just as the turning of a kaleidoscope just 1 millimeter is a small change, the results in the case of kaleidoscopes, as well as in our own teaching, are often very large and, in fact, profound. And we produce effects rarely or never before seen. Ultimately, I try small changes and invite you to join me to see more clearly what we are each capable of and how our preconceived ideas and premises, as well as textbooks, tests, and rules set by boards of education and principals, sometimes limit this capability. If we realize how much more is within us, it is more likely we will be able to aid our students in coming to the same realization. Such conscious realization, paradoxically, leads in my experience to more freedom, for as we become aware of a greater range of what we do on the unconscious level, we're able to use a greater range consciously. Said another way, as we explore our craft by describing, recording, transcribing, and analyzing communications, rather than by seeking prescriptions and judgments from others, we realize that we do not need to seek alternatives from those in charge, rather than ourselves or our peers, and that we do not have to work alone within our autonomous but isolated and lonely classrooms, rather than with colleagues and our students. Again, I wrote this in 1987 in Breaking Rules. One of my assumptions that underlines the idea of making small changes is that we should never assume that what we say or write and another hears or reads mean the same to both of us, and that even if we think the meanings are the same, the actual and supposed assumptions and intentions are likely to be different. Communication is a miracle, not the norm. As Gatteno, Gattegno, the originator and author of The Silent Way, 1971, was fond of saying during workshops he did in the 70s. Or, as George Bernard Shaw quipped, the single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place. The single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place. The words small changes, enhancing, predicting, problem solving, reducing ambiguity, awakening, discovering, risking, moving from ha to o to aha, reminding people of what they already know, are what I believe learning is made up of. Small changes, enhancing, predicting, problem solving, reducing ambiguity, awakening, discovering, thinking, moving from ha to o to aha, reminding people of what they already know, are what I believe learning is made up of. But these words mean very different things to different people, and unless we compare these words with activities and see to what extent they match, these words, like all words we use to discuss our teaching, are not very useful. A central flaw in teacher preparation and development is the assumption that the terms used match what teachers actually do, and that the terms mean the same thing to all teachers. Explicit error correction, communicative activities, extensive reading, choose your favorite fad. None of the terms describe reality. Calling something we do communicative does not make the activity communicative. A related assumption of mine is that our role as teachers is to remind people of what they already know, to tap into their experiences and knowledge, as well as their natural curiosity and thinking. Most studies of classroom interaction show that many teachers assume that their role is to show students what they do not know and then try to teach them through explanations. I have found this way of teaching to be inefficient and ineffective for most language learning, and also for most teacher preparation. Some people see no reason to make any changes, large or small, because they believe what they are doing is sufficient. Others think that there's no reason to change because there's a great deal of variety in the activities in their classrooms. Douglas Barnes says this about teachers' reluctance to record and transcribe their lessons. Quote, suggesting to teachers that there are patterns in their classroom behavior which can be described and compared with that of other teachers or with their own on another occasion is a recipe for unpopularity, because teachers believe that their teaching is a unique response to what their students say and do, arising moment by moment, during lessons. There is, however, much evidence to show that there are common patterns in teaching behavior and that some of these can be generalized across different levels of education and even from country to country if we confine ourselves to highly industrialized nations. This was Douglas Barnes in 1978, From Communication to Curriculum, one of the best books I've ever encountered, and I owe a great debt to Douglas Barnes, and much of what I write about in Small Changes I owe to his ideas. If you find routine in a small range of classroom activities gratifying, consider how they might be stultifying. If you and your students are comfortable with your day-to-day activities, consider how the activities might be tedious and boring and might lead to comfort, but not necessarily to the most efficient or effective long-term learning. Here is how Alan Maley, M-A-L-E-Y, described the idea of trying the opposite, one of the ways I suggest to make small changes. Quote, a heuristic, H-E-U-R-I-S-T-I-C, is a rule of thumb. If I do this, what will happen? Fanselow's idea of trying the opposite is highly generative of new ideas. Fanselow's point, which is worth thinking about, is that if we never try an alternative way of doing things, we never know what might have happened. Heuristics, again, H-E-U-R-I-S-T-I-C-S, another word for activities or methods, are a handy way of trying new ways of doing things. Fanselow argues that it is only by systematically breaking the unwritten rules or habits in our classrooms that we can discover new and possibly better ways of doing things. This is indeed a powerful heuristic and highly generative of new ideas, some of them worth holding on to. Tips on recording classes. Most DVDs of classes produced by publishers and boards of education are produced with a camera focused on the teacher. There are occasional quick scans of the students, but it is impossible to hear what the students say or really see what they are doing most of the time. As a result, there is no way we can analyze the interactions. When you make a video recording of your class, point the camera at a couple of students for 10 minutes, then at another pair, so that you have a recording in which you can hear what half a dozen pairs of students are saying and see what they're doing, 2 at a time, 2 for 10 minutes, 2 more for 10 minutes. You will be able to hear yourself easily. If you have a couple of students take pictures during class of what you do and what is written on the board, and also a few shots of you asking questions, you can see your gestures, movements, and what mediums you use other than writing words. P.S. The idea of making small changes is common in many areas. When people cook, they alter the amount of spices they add, the time they cook the ingredients, and the size of items they cut, to cite a few options. Children try riding bicycles without holding onto the handlebars. Try to see how fast they can run backwards. Just a couple of small changes that come to mind.
Okay, we hope you enjoyed that. This is the final episode in this short series, but just a reminder that the full ebook version has links to videos, which are very useful in terms of looking at examples of some of the things that John is talking about. And these audio extracts are just a small part of the whole book, so we would strongly recommend you looking at the full version if you've enjoyed what you've heard here. The book is available on Amazon as a Kindle book and on iBooks. And if you go to the itdi.pro website, you can find a lot more information about it there. So we hope you enjoyed this. We'll be back soon with a regular episode. Goodbye.